Sit back and throw one back with your pinky in the air and a middle finger to the world, and join me, the eclectic gentleman Stephen Watts, as we look back on this day in pro wrestling history. But before we do, put that drink down, like, share, and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get our wrestling history on. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it is October 22nd, and we're going to start off as we always do on a positive note. That's right, these are your pro wrestling birthdays. 1942, former WWF World Heavyweight Champion Pedro Morales. 1943, one of the baddest men on the planet, Bad News Brown. 1945, the man who has sold us more magazines than anybody else, Bill Apter. 1955, Washington, D.C.'s own Pork Chop Cash. 1972, the man with no neck, D'Lo Brown. And last but not least, 1983, Taya Valkyrie. Of course, on the flip side of that coin, your pro wrestling deaths for October 22nd. 1964, former St. Louis promoter, Tom Pax. Alright, enough of the sad stuff. It's time to get to the meat and potatoes. That's right, these are your pro wrestling history highlights for October 22nd. Jumping in the Wayback Machine and going all the way to 1938, where we see Jack McLaughlin defeat Pete Troups in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to become the first Canadian junior heavyweight champion. Leaping over the 40s and going straight to 1956, Ray Gunkel and the Amazing Zuma defeat Gene Kelly, aka Gene Knitsky, and Len Crosby to win the NWA Texas Tag Team titles in Fort Worth, Texas. That next year in 1957, Kurt Von Himmler and Juan Onita defeat Doug and Red Donovan to win the NWA Pacific Northwest Tag Team titles. Grooving into the 60s, 1962, the Medics win their second NWA Southern Tag Team titles by defeating Lester Welcher and Buddy Fuller in Memphis, Tennessee. 3 years later in 1965, Danny McShane wins the NWA Louisiana Heavyweight title from Bobby Fields in Lafayette, Louisiana, ending Fields' second reign. That next year in 1966, George and Sandy Scott defeat Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard for the IWA Australian Tag Team titles in Melbourne, Australia. Our final stop in the groovy 60s, 1969. Curtis Iokea and Ripper Collins begin their fourth reign as NWA Hawaii Tag Team Champions when they defeat Kurt and Carl Von Steiger in Honolulu, Hawaii. Grabbing my bell bottoms and disco ducking it into the 70s, 1976. Gene and Ole Anderson win their fourth NWA Georgia Tag Team titles by defeating Tom Jones and Pork Chop Cash in Atlanta, Georgia. Staying in 1976, the Wrestling Pro wins his fourth NWA Alabama Heavyweight title by defeating Greg Peterson. Our final stop in the 70s, Ivan Putski and Tito Santana defeat Johnny and Jerry Valentine for the WWF World Tag Team titles in New York City in 1979. Grabbing my boombox and going to the 80s, 1981. Don Kent and Bruno Becker defeat Jack and Jerry Briscoe for the WWC North American Tag Team titles in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Moving ahead 3 years to 1984, the Fantastics Tommy Rogers and Bobby Fulton defeat the Long Riders Scott Irwin and Bill Irwin in Fort Worth, Texas to win the NWA America's Tag Team titles, ending the Riders' fourth reign. Staying in 1984, the Fabulous Ones Steve Keirn and Stan Lane defeat Rick Rude and King Kong Bundy to win the AWA Southern Tag Team titles in Memphis, Tennessee, beginning Keirn and Lane's 8th of an eventual 14 reigns as champions. The next year in 1985, Mike Miller and Moondog Moretti defeat Steve Simpson and Joe Savaldi for the NWA Pacific Northwest Tag Team titles in Fort Lewis, Washington. Grabbing my flannel and going to the decade of grunge, 1995. The WWF held their fourth In Your House pay-per-view in Manitoba, Canada. It is most notable for Goldust making his WWF debut, defeating Marty Jannetty. Those were your short but sweet pro wrestling history highlights for October 22nd. I'm the eclectic gentleman Stephen Watts, and we'll see you tomorrow.